Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Cryptic Clubhouse. I am your host, Brian, and I am thrilled to have you join me today on this journey. Whether it be for the mysteries, the deep dives, or just to have some fun along the way, you're in the right place. So why don't you go ahead and grab yourself some popcorn and get comfortable, and let me guide you through these wild, weird, and wonderful stories. Let's get started. The Ninth Legion, Rome's Lost Warriors, vanished sometime between 121 and 130 AD. More than 5,000 men, fully armed, highly trained, and deeply feared across the empire, simply disappeared, with no final orders given, no grave markers, and no scroll tucked away in some dusty archive. Just a gap in the record, a silence that echoed across the centuries. In order to understand the scale of that loss, you really have to take a look at where the world was back then. You have to think that the world only had 300 million people. Rome only had between 60 and 70 million. Of that, maybe half were women, a good portion children, and another good portion were out of fighting age. A single legion of 5,000 soldiers, that was no small number. It was a military machine, a political instrument, a symbol of Roman order, law, and fear. And for it to vanish without any ceremony or mention is the ancient equivalent of a town just disappearing out of thin air, with no one blinking, no one giving a second thought, and no one caring. The silence isn't suspicious, it's haunting. Now, before we can go and get lost in the theories, the battlefield whispers, the bureaucratic cover-ups, and the tale of mist and myth, we need to understand exactly what a Roman legion was, what it meant to be a part of a Roman legion, because to grasp the weight of the disappearance, we first need to understand exactly the force that vanished. So what was a Roman legion? Well, the answer entirely depends on when you're asking. Because the Roman military machine wasn't a static thing, it evolved constantly. It was shaped by centuries of warfare, innovation, and necessity. What a legion looked like under Julius Caesar was definitely not the same that marched under Hadrian. The Romans were masters of adaptation. Their armies reflected that, shifting tactics, formation, and structure as the world changed around them. Now, in order to really understand exactly what a Roman legion was, I think it is important that we go all the way back to the beginning. Back to when Rome looked something like that. Back to the days of the Roman kingdom. This was Rome in its infancy, not yet an empire, not even a republic. It was just a rising city-state surrounded by rival tribes and looming threats. Now, the early history of Rome is half legend, half archaeology. It's a very murky past. Much of what we do know comes from later Roman writers that are just trying to reconstruct a past that they have never saw. But even through the fog, a rough picture does begin to form. In this early era, Roman legion wasn't exactly the professional war machine that we would think of it today. It was closer to something like a war band or like a militia. A loosely organized group of citizen soldiers that were called up when danger loomed. The typical size would be around 1,000 men, maybe. It was not permanent, it was not standing, it was certainly not uniform. These early legions were built out of units called centurae, literally hundreds, brought together as needed. More like a tribal muster than a modern-day army. They didn't fight for conquest. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to survive, defending their homes, their land, and their city's fragile future against tribes and raiders who might want to harm them. And while their tactics were still simple compared to the disciplined formations of later centuries, the seeds were still there. The Roman obsession with structure, with rank, and with order in the chaos of battle. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would one day stretch from the highlands of Scotland to the deserts of Arabia. But here, in the cradle of the Roman kingdom, the legion was still finding its shape, not yet an empire's blade, but as a city's shield. Now, the soldiers of this early Roman kingdom didn't look anything like the gleaming uniformed legionaries that you might picture today. There was no rows of polished armor, no crimson cloaks, nothing. These men were farmers and craftsmen, plain and simple. They were called away from their fields and their forges to defend their homes. Their gear was minimal, and a lot of the times it was scarce. Most wore little more than simple tunics, rough leather helmets, and carried a light oval shield made out of wood and hide. A few might have even had access to bronze weapons, family heirlooms, or trophies from past skirmishes. But, for the most part, it was whatever they could afford and or improvise. This, however, changed over time. As Rome grew and came into closer contact with the wealthier Greek colonies of southern Italy, they began to borrow some of their ideas, especially when it came to things like warfare. The Greeks were fighting in these dense formations using these heavy shields and these long spears. And so, towards the end of the kingdom period, Rome began to also adopt the hoplite style. Disciplined lines of heavily armed soldiers fighting in a single unified wall of bronze and iron. It was a major leap forward from warband to war machine. The soldiers would begin to look something more along the lines of something like that. Bronze helmets, crested with horsehairs, a round shield called an aspis, long spears held in tight ranks, and armor. At least for those who were able to afford it. It was still far from the professional legions of the empire, but it marked the beginning of a new philosophy. War, not as just survival, but as a structure, as a strategy. And as you can imagine, these changes were for way more than just for cosmetic purposes. They marked a dramatic shift in how all Roman soldiers would fight, live, and die on the battlefield. Their shields became much larger, they became much sturdier, and they were built to not just block a blow, but to also form the front line of a human wall. And perhaps more importantly, metal body armor began to first make its appearance in Roman warfare. The better equipped soldiers formed what was called the classis. They were the upper class on the battlefield. They wore things like the bronze cuirasses, or they could have worn some scale armor, and they would have carried heavier weaponry. They were positioned right in the middle of the battle. Now, what if you couldn't afford that kind of protection? You were still expected to be out there. The lightly armed and vulnerable, operating more like warriors of the Old Kingdom, these soldiers were known as the infraclassum, literally the beneath class. It was a harsh title, but it was also a brutally honest one. As Rome began to transition from the Kingdom period to the Republic period, things began to accelerate at a much faster pace. Structure became far more organized and far more standardized. Rome was able to field 2 standing legions at this time. Each of these legions were made up of roughly 3,000 hoplites, 1,200 light infantry, and a cavalry force of about 300 riders. And for the first time, these soldiers weren't just defending their homes, they were being paid to fight. This was the dawn of professional Roman warfare. And as it always does, with war came many innovations. During the Republic, Rome found itself in several brutal conflicts, including the First and Second Punic Wars. In these conflicts, they didn't just fight for survival, but they also fought for dominance. In Spain, Roman troops encountered several new styles of combat and new weapons. And they adapted very fast. One of the most significant changes was the adaptation of the gladius haspenus, the Spanish short sword. Compact, deadly, and perfect for close combat, it became the defining weapon of the Roman legionary. Around this time, Rome also began to work with some steel. They crafted better armor, stronger blades, and more reliable gear. The legion swelled in size as well. What was once a small citizen militia became a massive semi-permanent fighting force. In times of a crisis, a single legion had the ability to grow to up to 6,000 men. This was a tidal wave of iron and discipline, and it moved with a terrifying precision. Alright, now let's move into the late Republic stages. This is where things start to get really, really interesting. This is the point where Rome stops thinking of war as something that just kind of happens occasionally. No, this is where Rome starts to treat war like a full-time job. The temporary levies and the citizen soldiers are gone now. They begin to fade into history. And in their place rises something far more enduring and way more dangerous, the professional Roman army. This is where we start to see the birth of the legions that we think of when we picture them today. This is the kind that marched under Julius Caesar, armored, disciplined, and relentless. The classic Roman war machine. And it wasn't just a stylistic change, this change was born out of a sheer necessity. Rome had expanded far beyond a city-state by this point, and it became an ancient juggernaut, a continental force of politics, infrastructure, and conquest. And to hold that much territory, you couldn't just have governors and roads. No, you also needed to have soldiers, and a lot of them. Rome now looks something like this, a sprawling empire stitched together by blood and ambition. The legions were stationed like pressure points across a map, constantly under the threat of unraveling. At the heart of this machine was the Imperial Legion, each one a finely tuned unit of destruction made up of almost entirely heavy infantry. Gone were the light armored skirmishers of the early Republic. These new soldiers were professionals. They trained year-round, they drilled in formation, they studied siegecraft, and they carried standardized gear designed not just for survival but for dominating the battlefield. They weren't just troops, they were a force of nature, and for a time they were thought to be practically unbeatable by any non-Roman force on the battlefield. Now, by the height of the empire, especially under Emperor Augustus, the Roman military had ballooned massively to staggering proportions. It employed over 450,000 men. They were divided into 33 legions and more than 400 auxiliary units. It was a war machine that spread across continents, keeping order, crushing resistance, and projecting the might of Rome into every single corner of the known world. The empire now stretched from the fog-drenched highlands of Britain to the golden sands of North Africa, from the forests of Germania to the ancient cities of the East. Rome wasn't just a place anymore, it was an idea, it was a legend. But like all legends, it began to change. In the later years of the empire, the cracks really started to show. Economic strain, recruitment issues, and the sheer weight of holding everything together led to a complete restructuring of the legions. Traditional formations were completely broken apart and were replaced by smaller and faster units. Local militias and allied barbarian forces were forced to fill the gaps. The legions didn't vanish, but their roles completely shifted. They became less the edge of the Roman sword and more of its crumbling hilt. And this brings us finally back to the main subject of our story, the Ninth Legion. So now what do we know about the start of the Ninth Legion? We actually don't know a lot. We don't know exactly when the Ninth Legion was born. Its origin, like so much of ancient history, are half-remembered shadows whispered into being before the ink ever even hits paper. What we do know, however, is that the first traceable footprints of the Ninth Legion appears during the Siege of Alencum in 90 BC. This was during the heart of the brutal social war, a conflict not against a foreign enemy, but against Rome's own former allies. A civil war of blood and betrayal. And the Ninth was right there in the middle of it, already tempered in the fires of rebellion. Now, years later, in the year 58 BC, the Legion would fall under the command of a man whose name would echo across the centuries, Gaius Julius Caesar. As governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Caesar had command of 6 legions at this time, but the Ninth was one of his oldest and most reliable. When he began his bloody conquest of Gaul, turning his gaze north towards the Helvetii tribe, the Ninth marched with him into the forest, into the fog, and also into legend. About a decade later, in 48 BC, during Julius Caesar's civil war, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the Ninth would face off against one of its darkest trials yet. Stationed along a fresh line of fortification, the Legion had been hit by a sudden and devastating assault by Pompey's forces. The attack broke straight through their defenses, and men would fall in droves. Their lines buckled completely. For a moment, just a rare moment, Caesar's aura of invincibility had been cracked, and the Ninth had been forced into a retreat. They were bloodied but not broken. Dyrrhachium would go down as one of the few tactical defeats of Caesar's career, and the Ninth had been at its heart. But even in the face of such a humiliating defeat, the Legion would endure. And Julius Caesar would even put more faith into these guys. He would put them on the front lines at the Battle of Feralis, where they would stare down a force that outnumbered them, outflanked them, and outmatched them in almost every conceivable way. But in the dust and chaos of that battlefield, the Ninth would hold their ground. They didn't just survive, they helped turn the tide, and Pompey's forces were routed. Caesar's grip on Rome was tightened, and the Ninth had carved its name into the bones of history. Now, after Feralis, we don't have 100% certainty on where the Ninth would have went. It is more than likely that they would have followed Caesar down into North Africa, chasing down the last embers of the Pompeian resistance. They would have been going after commanders like Scipio and Cato the Younger. Then, for a while, the trail goes dim. Historians believe that the Legion might have been able to stand down or allowed to rest for a while, and this would be the last we would hear about them under Julius Caesar. However, they would make a return. A few years later, under the rule of Octavian, Caesar's heir and soon to become Augustus, the Ninth was likely reformed and rearmed. They may have marched in the brutal campaign against Sextus Pompey, and fought through civil unrest and ultimately pledged their loyalty to the new order rising in Rome's ashes. Now, after serving along the empire's northern frontiers for a few years, the Ninth Legion would have been transferred to Britain sometime around 43 AD. This would have been part of Emperor Claudius's invasion force, and they would have been under the command of a man named Aulus Pilatus. They were among the first legions to set foot on the island, and they would have spearheaded Rome's expansion into this unfamiliar land that we today know as Britain. In the years that followed, the Ninth became heavily involved in subduing British resistance, particularly in the campaign against Caradicus, a tribal leader who had become one of Rome's most tenacious enemies. While the Ninth took part in several actions during this time, it was another legion, under Governor Asturius Scapula, that eventually captured Caradicus in 50 AD. Still, the Ninth was still right there in the thick of things, fighting in a dense forest through rough terrains against enemies who would know the land so much better than they did. A few years later, in 60 or 61 AD, Boudicca's rebellion started. The Queen of the Iceni, driven by Roman cruelty and humiliation, would rally tens of thousands of warriors to her side, and she launched a revolt that shocked the empire. As Boudicca's forces swept through Roman towns, the Ninth Legion marched to intercept them, aiming to relieve the besieged settlement that we now call Colchester. But they never made it. Somewhere along the road, the legion was ambushed. The infantry, likely exhausted and outnumbered, were caught off guard completely. They were wiped out to almost the very last man, and only the cavalry was able to survive. They were able to break away under the command of Quintus Petulus Cerealis and retreated in disgrace. It was a brutal, humiliating defeat, and it was one of the worst suffered by Rome during the entire rebellion. Now, the Ninth didn't just disappear here, though. If they did, there wouldn't be a video because we would have all known what happened. They would have just gotten their ass kicked in Britain, and that would have been the end of the story. No, they were reinforced and they continued to serve in Britain for many more years. However, the loss did leave a lot of scars, not just on the Legion, but also on the Roman psyche. Boudicca's uprising proved that the empire wasn't invincible anymore, and in response, Rome had to clamp down hard. They flooded the province with reinforcements, and they tightened their grip on the land even further. The Ninth Legion was still stationed in Britain during Rome's northern campaigns, what would become the push into the wild, untamed lands of modern-day Scotland. While the surviving records don't name them in any specific engagement, their presence in the region makes it highly unlikely that they weren't involved in the long, grueling effort to break the resistance of the Caledonian tribes. These were warriors who didn't fight like the Gauls or the Germans. They instead used the land itself, the very mountains and bogs and mist that surround them. They used them as weapons. Now, the most famous clash of this campaign came in the early 80s AD, at the Battle of Mons Grupus, where Roman forces under the leadership of Governor Julius Agricola would meet the Caledonians in an open battle. According to Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, and the only surviving source for this event, the Romans won this battle in a crushing defeat. But there was a catch. Tacitus doesn't list which legions fought there. It is a blank spot. And here, that really stands out. The last confirmed traces of the Ninth Legion comes from a stone slab unearthed in 1864 in the modern-day city of York, known in Roman times as Eboracum. It's a dedication carved into limestone marking the reconstruction of a part of the legionary fortress. The name on it? Legio IX Hispana. That was around 108 AD, and then nothing. After that inscription, the Ninth vanished from all official records, no more orders, no more movements, no more honors. It's as if they stepped off the edge of the map and into legend. Their disappearance remains one of Rome's most enduring and unsettling mysteries. Now let's get into the theories. So our first theory takes us all the way from the misty hills of Britain all the way to the deserts of Judea. Some historians and amateur sleuths believe that the Ninth Legion didn't just vanish into Britain at all. Instead, they believed that the Legion was quietly transferred across the empire to fight in one of Rome's bloodiest and most brutal uprisings in their history, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which erupted in 132 AD. This wasn't just a minor rebellion, however. This was a full-scale scorched earth conflict. The Jewish population, under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, launched a massive revolt against Roman rule. And Rome, as it was very well known to do, responded with overwhelming force. Cassius Dio claimed that about 580,000 Jews were killed during this conflict, and Roman losses, while they weren't officially recorded, are estimated to be around the area of 50,000 troops. This would be a staggering toll, even by Roman standards. Rome had to call in 6 full legions and dozens of auxiliary units from across the empire in order to crush this rebellion. So if the Ninth had quietly vanished from Britain before 132 AD, maybe they weren't just gone. Maybe they just got reassigned, shipped out to Judea and dropped in the middle of a brutal guerrilla war in an unfamiliar territory, and swallowed up in the chaos. You can imagine it, marching through a dry, hostile terrain, constant ambushes, no reinforcements, no supply lines, just an exhausted, far-from-home legion worn down by attrition until there was nothing left, with no survivors and no one to tell the tale. This sounds dramatic, right? This could have happened, but here's the problem. This theory leans very hard on speculation, and it comes up very short on actual evidence. The Bar Kokhba revolt is one of the most well-documented conflicts of the Roman imperial period. We know which legions were sent, we have records of their casualties, and the 9th Legion isn't listed anywhere, not once, not even a footnote. And then there's the timeline. The last confirmed mention of the 9th Legion is in York around 108 AD. The Bar Kokhba revolt doesn't begin until 132 AD. That is a 24-year gap. So for this theory to hold any water, the 9th would have had to have vanished from record for over 2 decades, and then suddenly, somehow, reappear in one of the biggest wars of the century without even being mentioned by anyone. Now that's a lot of silence to just explain away. Don't get me wrong, it's a cool theory, and the image of the 9th Legion trudging off into some desert to just die in some forgotten battle is very haunting, but realistically, does it hold up? I don't think so. The Romans weren't exactly shy about writing things down, especially when it came to military matters. If a whole legion had just disappeared during the Bar Kokhba revolt, which, as we said, is one of the most documented wars in Roman imperial history, someone would have said something. It wouldn't have just been forgotten, it wouldn't have just been erased. Another theory I really like is that the 9th Legion didn't just vanish into Britain, but instead they were transferred somewhere else, to either Germania or Gaul, and they just got wiped out there. At first glance, this might sound like a stretch, but when you start to put together the pieces, what was happening politically, what was happening militarily, and what was happening geographically at the time, the theory starts to look really plausible. Let's start with the timeline. The last confirmed trace of the 9th Legion is that stone inscription in York from around 108 AD. After that, there was nothing, no paperwork, no tombs, no honors, nothing. But what we do know is that during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, who took power in 117 AD, Rome would have shifted its entire strategy. Hadrian was not an expansionist. He wasn't interested in chasing glory across new frontiers like Emperor Trajan before him. He wanted order and he wanted stability. He wanted his empire to consolidate and not conquer. And of course, with that change in philosophy also meant reshuffling of Rome's legions. Hadrian spent the earlier part of his rule moving troops around. He moved them to reinforce vulnerable provinces, and he also made sure that the empire's borders were secure. As we know, Hadrian's Wall was built around this time. It is entirely possible that during this logistical reshuffling, the 9th might have been pulled out of Britain. Maybe because things were cooling down in the area that they were in, or maybe because the Legion wasn't entirely at full strength after the Boudicca's disaster and years of hard frontier fighting. So the 9th might have been relocated, maybe to Germania or maybe to Gaul. These two regions were constantly boiling just underneath the surface, and even if there wasn't a massive recorded war, there was a constant stream of raids, tribal revolts, and sudden flare-ups. Roman legions stationed in this area lived with their swords always half drawn. Now, imagine this. The Ninth Legion, already battle-worn and maybe not quite back to full numbers, is sent to one of these volatile frontier zones. They're building a road, escorting a supply convoy, reinforcing a vulnerable outpost, and then they're just ambushed. Germanic tribes, masters of the forest, and lightning-fast surprise attacks swarm them. There is no help nearby, no cavalry coming over the hill. The Ninth gets caught in rough terrain, far from home, outnumbered. It's brutal, it's fast, and it would have been complete. Now, this is where things start to get interesting, and also very Roman. If word got out that an entire Roman legion had just been wiped off the map by tribes that Rome still considered to be vastly inferior to them, this would have been a massive political scandal. The people would demand justice. The Senate would call for vengeance. And Hadrian, he would be under massive pressure to launch a retaliatory war. But this wouldn't be what Hadrian wanted. So maybe he would have just made it disappear quietly with no announcement, no statues, no official mourning period, just a quiet decision behind closed doors. Hey, let's not talk about the Ninth. And honestly, it would have been pretty easy to make this happen. Rome's record keeping was excellent at the time, but primarily in cities, like in Judea. But on the frontiers, in the wilds of Gaul or in the dark forests of Germania, things could have very easily slipped through the cracks. And especially if there was no survivors that came back to file a report. Especially if someone high up wanted this to be erased and swept away without a trace. This theory would also explain why the Ninth vanishes seemingly without a trace. They weren't disbanded, they weren't reassigned, they were destroyed in a way that left no one behind to tell the story. And Rome, always obsessed with its image, chose silence over scandal. So maybe that's where the Ninth met its end. Not in the cold hills of Caledonia, but somewhere deeper in the empire. Somewhere just far enough off the map that no one would have noticed when 5,000 men never came home. So here's another theory that some people bring up when trying to explain what might have happened to the Ninth Legion. Maybe they didn't fall in battle at all. Maybe they were wiped out by something even more chilling. The Roman government itself, not in some flashy battlefield ambush, but in a cold, calculated act of political cleansing. The idea behind this is that either the Ninth might have backed the wrong side of a rebellion, they might have refused a critical order, or that maybe they even tried to rebel themselves, something that would have crossed the line hard in ancient Rome. And the empire's response? It would have been total destruction, followed by complete erasure. Someone high up may have decided that the best move wasn't just to punish the legion, it was to make them disappear entirely like they had never even existed. As wild as this might sound, this kind of thing actually happened in ancient Rome. The empire had a process for it. It was called damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory. If someone seriously betrayed the state or embarrassed the ruling class, they didn't just get executed. No, their names were scraped off of monuments, statues would have been smashed, and achievements would be wiped completely from official records. It was like Rome's version of hitting the delete on your entire existence. Usually, this was aimed at disgraced emperors or major political enemies. But this theory here is that what if it happened to a whole legion? Now that's the part that really gets your imagination going. Thousands of men, officers, standard bearers, veterans, medics, camp followers, all just erased in one single sweep. No memorials, no letters home, just gone and forgotten. Now, for this to even be remotely possible, the Ninth would have had to do something seriously unforgivable, like attempting a coup or defecting to an enemy army, or maybe even getting involved in some internal conspiracy. And while Rome was known for its ruthless efficiency, applying damnatio memoriae on that scale would have just been a complete nightmare. You're talking about thousands of names across multiple provinces, records in military, civic, and financial logs. It would have taken a coordinated effort to erase all of those traces. And yet maybe that's the point. Because what's so strange about the Ninth is that everything is so quiet. If they had just lost a battle, there should have been mourning. If they had been relocated, there should have been orders. If they had been reassigned, you'd expect a paper trail. But instead we get nothing. No headlines, no outrage, no aftermath. Now let's compare that to something like the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where 3 Roman legions were ambushed and annihilated by Germanic tribes. That loss echoed across the empire, and Augustus himself reportedly walked the halls of his palace screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legion." But with the Ninth, there's nothing. It's radio silence, no public grief, no mention of vengeance, just a blank space in history records. And that's what keeps this theory alive. Maybe the silence isn't just an accident. Maybe it's intentional. Maybe Rome didn't warn them because they believed the Ninth got what they had deserved. If the Legion had turned traitor, the Empire might have decided that the best thing to do was to just make them disappear and to move on, with no scandal, no story, and no sympathy. Sure, it's a long shot, but in an empire obsessed with control, especially control of its own mythology, burying an ugly truth wasn't just possible, it was a policy. Now, probably the most boring but entirely plausible explanation for the disappearance of the Ninth Legion is this. Maybe they weren't wiped out in a battle, or lost in some mysterious campaign, or even swallowed by the fogs of legend. Maybe they were just disbanded. Quietly, bureaucratically, and without any drama at all. And you might be sitting there asking yourself, why did this happen? Well, this could have happened for a few reasons. Over time, the Legion might have been worn down not by one catastrophic event, but by slow attrition. Casualties from minor skirmishes, illnesses, desertion, and even age could have steadily chirped away at their numbers. Eventually, the unit may have just been too understrength to operate at an effective level. Alternatively, they might have suffered another embarrassing defeat. Not a total wipeout, but bad enough that Rome didn't exactly want to talk about it. Considering the Ninth's earlier humiliation at the Budician Revolt in 60 AD, when most of their infantry had been slaughtered in an ambush, it's not hard to imagine that the Empire might have just decided that this particular legion had just outlived its usefulness. In that case, the solution would have been very simple. They would have quietly retired the Ninth and reassigned the remaining men to other units, with no announcements, no ceremonies, just erase the name from the legion rolls and you would move on. That brings us to a widely discussed sub-theory. The remnants of the Ninth were merged with Legion 6 Vitrix, a legion brought from the Rhine frontier and stationed in Britain at around 122 AD. That also just so happens to be the same year that Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain and ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall. The timeline fits almost too well. The Ninth disappears from historical records, the Sixth shows up and takes its place, and there's no gaps, no overlaps, just a clean swap. And in reality, if two legions were combined for administrative reasons, it wouldn't have exactly made any waves. This wasn't the kind of thing senators or poets would write about. There'd be no grand battle, no hero send-off, no scandal. Just a quiet restructuring of Rome's massive military bureaucracy, the kind of logistical reshuffling that probably happened dozens of times throughout the Empire's history. And let's be honest, if nobody was lost in a blaze of glory, if there was no tragedy, no triumph to memorialize, who would have cared? Now let's take a little detour from the more grounded theories and spend some time looking at a theory that's a little bit more fun, more mysterious, and a little bit supernatural. It's the idea that the Ninth Legion wasn't destroyed in a battle, wasn't quietly reassigned or disbanded, but it was instead swallowed up by the fog. Not an ordinary fog, of course, but something older and deeper and stranger. A supernatural mist tied to sacred lands and ancient forces. This theory draws from both Celtic and Roman folklore, and while there's no hard evidence behind it, it's rooted in the kinds of belief that were genuinely held by people living in Britain during the Roman period. In many religious and cultural traditions of the time, especially among Celtic tribes in Britain, there were powerful ideas of sacred and taboo places, areas of land where the natural and supernatural worlds were believed to overlap. These were sites like burial grounds, stone circles, ancient groves, and ritual bogs. Entering them without permission, especially with violence or weapons, was thought to invite disaster. Whether that meant madness, divine retribution, or even complete spiritual disappearance, these weren't just spooky campfire stories. They were the foundational parts of how people viewed the land and their relationship. Among these beliefs were the idea of so-called thin places, locations where the veil between the human world and the other world was particularly fragile. In these thin places, strange things were said to happen. Time could behave differently, sounds could come from out of nowhere, and people could just vanish. The other world itself wasn't exactly a version of hell or a version of heaven, but it was kind of like a parallel realm where spirits, gods, and the dead walked. Entering it didn't always require dying. Sometimes all it took was stepping in the wrong place at the wrong time, and once you cross that line, there might be no way back. What makes this theory even more intriguing is that the Romans themselves, despite their reputation for being rational and disciplined, were extremely superstitious. Roman soldiers followed strict rituals, watched for omens, and regularly made sacrifices to win favor of the gods. Military decisions could be delayed or even cancelled because of a bad reading of a bird flight or a priest dream. And when it came to foreign religious sites, Romans often chose to respect rather than destroy them, especially in the regions like Britain, where the local beliefs were seen as dangerous and even mysterious. The Druids in particular were feared not just as political leaders but as keepers of strange and powerful rites that the Romans didn't fully understand. Even Tacitus, writing about the conquest of Anglesey, described the Roman troops as being shaken by the sight of howling Druidic women, black-robed and frenzied, standing among sacred groves. So when you imagine the 9th Legion, a full Roman force armed to the teeth and marching with banners raised high, heading north into wild, unfamiliar lands, it's not exactly the hardest thing to picture them stepping into territory that locals might have avoided. Maybe it was a cursed valley or an ancient forest or a bog thick with fog. The kind of place where the map just kind of thins out and locals lower their voice. As the mist rolled in, visibility might have dropped to only a few feet. The air could have grown unnaturally still, maybe the sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by whispers they couldn't even explain. Maybe the men started seeing things in the fog, strange light, shadowy figures that didn't move like people. Maybe patrols didn't come back. Maybe the ground itself felt wrong underfoot, soft in places where it should have been hard, dry where it should have been wet. Maybe their scouts walked ahead and never returned. Maybe they set up camp and the night never quite ended. The fires wouldn't light, the food went bad, the horses panicked at nothing, and one by one the 9th vanished. Not all at once, but gradually slipping into something they couldn't understand, something older than Rome. And then nothing. No battle, no retreat, no survivors, no word, just silence. The kind of silence that lets legends grow in its place. This theory, as whimsical and eerie as it is, has captured people's imaginations for years, precisely because of how little we actually know about what happened to the 9th. The lack of a clear ending leaves space for ideas like this to take root. That's why it constantly shows up again and again in fiction. In novels like The Eagle of the Ninth, and even on TV shows like Doctor Who in the episode The Eater of Light, where the 9th Legion is trapped in another dimension fighting an ancient monster to keep it from entering our world. It's pure fantasy, of course, but it draws directly from this idea that the 9th didn't fall by the sword or arrows, but to something strange instead. Something they were never meant to find, or something that was waiting for them. Imagine, then, a forgotten administrative footnote, and maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the foggy glen in the north, the sounds of marching feet still echo, out of step with time, just beyond the veil. So out of all these theories we've explored, which one do I think is most likely? Personally, I lean towards the idea that the 9th wasn't swallowed by fog or torn apart by northern tribes, but instead, it would have been quietly transferred to Gaul or Germania, and eventually destroyed in some lesser-known and poorly documented conflict. It's not the most thrilling explanation, but it lines up the best with the timeline, the silence, and the few historical clues that we have. Now here's why this theory makes a lot of sense to me. The Legion disappears during a time when Rome was stretched extremely thin, dealing with constant rebellions, shifting borders, and imperial fatigue. Hadrian, the emperor at the time, wasn't exactly interested in conquest. He was a pragmatist, a builder, someone who focused on securing what Rome already had and not gambling for any more. If word had gotten out that a full Roman legion had been lost on some remote frontier, it could have sparked huge unrest, or worse, another rebellion in Britain or beyond, and Hadrian, he wouldn't have wanted that. Better to bury the failure than to advertise it. And out in the wilds of Germania or the backwoods of Gaul, far from Rome's polished bureaucracy, things got lost all the time. Reports didn't get filed, stones were uncarved, men disappeared, and the empire kept moving along. Rome was no stranger to quietly reshuffling legions, changing names, absorbing stragglers into other units, and letting inconvenient stories fade out of consciousness. So maybe the 9th wasn't lost in some glorious stand or swept away by some supernatural forces. Maybe it was just reassigned, overwhelmed, and forgotten, buried not under the earth, but under time, politics, and silence. And in its own way, that might be even more unsettling. But that's just my theory. What do you guys think happened to the 9th? Was it battle, bureaucracy, or something stranger still? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your take.